Good evening. Whoa, very good. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a real treat to have you in my house tonight.
Glad to be here.
You're always here. Welcome to the 8th Annual Forum on Women in Leadership, whether you're here in the McGowan Theater, at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., or joining us on our YouTube station or C-SPAN. A special welcome to our C-SPAN viewers. Tonight, we take a look at women in civil rights leadership, and we have a distinguished panel of speakers who will share their experiences and advice. Our program is made possible by the generous support of the National Archives Foundation and the William G. McGowan Charitable Fund, Inc. This program is also presented in partnership with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and we thank them for their support. And I believe Lonnie Bunch, the director, is not with us tonight. Okay, before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to let you know about two other programs coming up here in the McGowan Theater. On Tuesday, March 31st at 7 p.m., Paige Harrington of the Sewell Belmont House and Museum will lead a discussion on the temperance and women's suffrage movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And next month, on Friday, April 10th at 7 p.m., Tavis Smiley will discuss My Journey with Maya, his book honoring Maya Angelou. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby, as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive the calendar by regular mail or email, and you'll also find brochures about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby. And here's a little secret that I don't tell everyone. No one has ever been turned down for membership in the foundation. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century is well documented in our records here in Washington and across the country. We're familiar with the story of Rosa Parks and her refusal to move from her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Our Atlanta archives has her arrest records, but it also has the case files of Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, Claudette Colvin, and Mary Louise Smith, all black women who were arrested for refusing to give up their seats on Montgomery buses. Among Department of Justice records, you can find a letter from activist Ida B. Wells Barnett. She wrote to the President and to Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, expressing outrage over the lynching of a black postmaster and his 2-year-old daughter, and asked for compensation for the surviving family members. And in the records of the House of Representatives, we find pioneering African-American women like Shirley Chisholm. In one letter to the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, she expressed concern that women have not been able to testify and have their voice heard in hearings about the Equal Rights Amendment. In our records, you can find many more voices speaking on behalf of civil rights in the papers, photographs, and audio and video recordings created by the government in the course of its operations and now available to us today. Assisting us in our mission to increase awareness of our remarkable holdings is the National Archives Foundation. We're truly grateful for the support and enthusiasm of the Foundation's board members and its dedicated staff, which allows us to educate, entertain, and enlighten through our exhibits and public programs. And it's now my pleasure to turn you over to the president of the board of the National Archives Foundation, Alelia Bundles.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much, David. And David mentioned a lot of the reasons why I love the National Archives, all those incredible records that are here. How many have ever been to the National Archives? Good. How many of you have been here to do research? Good. How many have been here for programs? Great. Okay, so we want you to all come back to visit to come to programs. And as David said, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation, so we want you to go to archivesfoundation.org and pick out a membership level so that you will have a reserved seat and you won't have to wait in those long lines outside, and you'll get advance notice of what's going on. On behalf of the board of directors, of the National Archives Foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th Annual McGowan Forum on Women in Leadership. As a National Archives nonprofit partner, the Foundation generates financial and creative support for National Archives exhibitions, public programs, and educational initiatives. We are fortunate to have among our board members historians, filmmakers, former governors, and journalists like Cokie Roberts and Ken Burns and Michael Beschloss. And we truly would love for you to join us as members. And as I say, just log on to archivesfoundation.org and select the membership level. You'll also find information there about the informative and fun activities associated with the new Spirited Republic exhibition in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery that explores the history of alcohol in America. We have lots of tastings and other things going on within the next few months. So you may laugh, but it will be really fun. Derek Brown, who is one of the bartenders in America, is our ambassador, and he will be participating. We also would love for you to go to the David M. Rubenstein Gallery Records of Rights, where all of the people who weren't included in those wonderful, on that mural that we have in the rotunda where you see the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, they're not very, those people all sort of look a little bit alike. It's not just their breeches that look alike. But in the David and Rubenstein Gallery, there are documents related to civil rights, women's rights, and immigration. And this theater itself and tonight's program would not be possible without the generous support of one of our most important partners, the William G. McGowan Charitable Fund. In addition to its support of the National Archives Foundation, the Chicago-based McGowan Charitable Fund promotes, nurtures, and funds many other signature programs throughout the United States in 3 particular areas: community initiatives for those most vulnerable, education, and healthcare and medical research. Through the McGowan Fellows Program, the fund supports and inspires emerging business leaders. The vision of the fund is to have the kind of meaningful impact that creates sustainable change and empowers future generations to achieve their greatest potential. We are very pleased this evening to have with us 3 members of the McGowan Fund Board: Marianne Rossica Brand, Sherilyn Kingsbury, and Mary Alice Jinn, as well as the fund's executive director, Diana Spencer. Please help me welcome Ms. Kingsbury to the stage.
Welcome on behalf of the William G. McGowan Fund to the 8th Annual Forum on Women in Leadership. I'm Sherilyn Kingsbury, and I am a member of the board. William McGowan, CEO of telecommunications giant MCI, was a self-made global entrepreneur who never forgot his humble origins. A year after his death in 1992, members of his family established an open-ended charitable fund to honor Bill's legacy and preserve his values. The driving force behind the McGowan Fund's growing national presence was Sue Gin McGowan, Bill's widow and my beloved aunt. Sue passed away suddenly just 6 months ago today. Under her leadership, the fund gifted over $120 million to effective local-based organizations in the areas of education, health and medical research, and community service. Those grants support vital services for thousands of deserving Americans who otherwise lack a safety net. In 2003, the McGowan Fund partnered with the National Archives to develop this public theater, reflecting Bill McGowan's deep love of history, movies, and exploring contemporary issues. Very soon, our board instituted an annual fall forum, bringing together industry and government leaders for a lively public exchange of ideas involving commerce, technology, and government. Inspired by 5 years of enthused audience response and top-quality programming at the Fall Forum, Sue and the board added an annual Spring Forum, Women in Leadership. It spotlights female leaders in business, military, journalism, academia, the arts, science and medicine, and echoes Sue's lifelong commitment to empowering women and their voices. A Chinese-American entrepreneur, Sue encountered sexism, racism, and discrimination while building a single airline catering kitchen into a global, large-scale catering industry giant. Despite her enormous success, she continually sought to assure an equal playing field for women and minorities. An important role model for minority women, Sue would have loved to join our conversation tonight. In fact, we were here last year together, and we just really enjoyed the Women in Congressional Leadership program. Our theme this evening, Then and Now, Women in Civil Rights Leadership. Our panel will explore the influential leadership of African American women since the early days of the civil rights movement in the United States. What have their experiences been? How has their role evolved over the decades? Our panel will share stories and offer advice to young women now assuming leadership in the civil rights movement. Our moderator is an author and host of her own MSNBC show, Melissa Harris Perry. Panelists include sociologist and civil rights activist Joyce Ladner, Avis Jones De-Weever, former executive director of the National Council of Negro Women, Janai Nelson, associate director, counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and Charlene Carruthers, national director of Black Youth Project 100. On behalf of the McGowan Fund, thank you for being part of this unique dialogue between our outstanding presenters and an aware and engaged audience.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn, and I'm so glad that you gave everyone a little background on Sue. We really miss Sue and her warmth and her vision and her enthusiasm. She truly was an incredible board member, and her spirit is always going to be with us. So thank you for giving everybody that background. And now it's my pleasure to bring to you the panel. Melissa Harris Perry, Charlene Carruthers, Avis Jones De-Weever, Janai Nelson, and Joyce Ladner. And before I sit down, I just have to say a couple of these ladies are friends of mine, and others are people I watch on TV, and and I'm just very excited. I know you're in for a real treat.
Good evening. Good evening. So we've already had a great time. If we can reproduce 1/10 of what happened in the green room, I think you're going to be in for a great night. I want to start by invoking who I think of as a foremother of all gatherings of women of color interested in questions of social justice, and that is our own Anna Julia Cooper. If you have a current U.S. passport, whether you have it with you now or later, you should notice that at the top of the passport pages there are quotes in those back visa pages at the end, and the very, very last one on pages 26 and 27 is the only woman who appears in your passport. And this woman is, in fact, Anna Julia Cooper. And the quote that they chose from her is, "The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race or a sect, a party or a class. It is the cause of humankind, the very birthright of humanity." So it's worth knowing that Anna Julia Cooper is there in your passport, that when you travel as an American citizen abroad, that you travel in part under the voice and the words of Anna Julia Cooper. And part of the reason I want to invoke her in this moment is a reminder that the civil rights movement does not begin in 1950 whatever, and it does not end in 1960 whatever. That, in fact, we are always part of this long civil rights movement, that it is a movement that extends back to the 1600s and extends forward until this very moment. It's just that a lot of times we lost. Over and over and over again, there was effort, there was organization, there were leaders, and they came up against the power of the American state and white supremacy, male patriarchy, and they lost. But losing does not mean that they were not fighters, and it doesn't mean that they didn't lay a groundwork. And it also is a reminder that you don't necessarily get to live in the part of the civil rights movement where you win. sometimes your life is in the part of the civil rights movement that is losing some ground and then gaining some ground. You're not special. You live in a time where, of course, maybe there is some great arc of freedom, but we are an arc of history, and maybe it is bending towards justice, but indeed not in some sort of clear, single way. So I want to just begin then by reminding us that we're part of a long civil rights movement and that we have folks here who are part of that long movement and who are continuing in it. And I just have to start, and I had not planned to start here, but man, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, was the conversation between Joyce and Charlene that just happened about SNCC. So, if you don't know the work of the Black Youth Project 100, probably about the closest thing we have, maybe also Dream Defenders or what's happening in Ferguson. There are kind of spaces where young people are organizing in ways that are reminiscent of SNCC. But Charlene says to Joyce, man, we're always asking ourselves when we're kind of in an imperfect place, I wonder what SNCC would have been doing right now.
We weren't sure.
Yeah, and so I thought I would just begin with that conversation. Charlene, if you wanted to begin that conversation again.
Sure. So in BYP 100, we're a national organization of young Black 18 to 35-year-olds who really focus on transformative leadership development, direct action, organizing, public policy advocacy, and political education. And basically what that means is that we train, we organize, and mobilize young Black people every day. And we do it through how we think of it as a Black queer feminist lens. And so we approach the work in many ways how SNCC approached the work differently in that time. And we strive to make our decisions through a group-centered leadership approach. And so that means that, yes, I'm sitting here, I serve as the national director, but just earlier today someone called me and they said, can you all sponsor this event? And I said, well, I need to go back to our local leadership first. They have to vote on this because even though I'm in this particular role, I don't make the decisions about what happens locally on a day-to-day basis. And so we borrow that from SNCC in so many ways in Ella Baker's group-centered leadership model. And we talk about it all the time, and sometimes we romanticize it, right? Because we know it's not, we know it wasn't perfect, and we know it wasn't perfect. No movement, no part of the movement is perfect wherever we live in it. And so it's always this thing, how do we both build on the history and the ways of organizing before us, and also recognizing what needs to be done differently at the same time. So those are things that we struggle with on a day-to-day basis.
Want me to respond to that? Well, what would SNCC have done? Well, I'm not sure. None of us SNCC people would have been sure as to what we would have done because we had only one mantra, and that was let the people decide. And we engaged in this long dialectic back and forth. I remember being in Atlanta at a SNCC conference, 63, at the old Gammon Theological Seminary. And we went until about 3 o'clock that morning because with SNCC, every time you think you've reached a consensus, someone like Ivanhoe Donaldson is standing on the wall, said, but hey, wait, I didn't agree with that. And then you start the process all over again.
Yes.
So it went on and on and on and on. And don't ever, back then you would never, ever try to make a decision on behalf of anyone other than yourself. Because we kept each other honest, but I think it was because we were young and we were trying to find our own individual as well as group ways. And Ms. Baker was very interesting in that regard. That night when we stayed until about 3 o'clock, Ms. Baker would stand on the side, on the wall, along the wall a lot of times. Sometimes she'd sit, and she'd just watch and listen and listen. And finally, she would just say something. And then we didn't, it wasn't like she was saying, okay, now, come on, you got to make a decision. But she gave us some guidance. But she let the process play out a long time. And Ms. Hamer would stand up and she would just, she believed in democracy with a small d. And what fascinated me about them...
Democracy, but I'm in charge.
Well, but at 17, 18, 19 years old, we were all... Julian Bond and Bob Moses were the oldest, and they were... No, not Julian, but Bob was the oldest. He was like 25, 26. And you had kids from 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. And I think that what always fascinated me was that here are these older people, like Miss Baker, Miss Hamer, and my cousin Victoria Gray Adams. What is it that they see in us that caused them to go along with us? And what I finally came to understand, and years later, was that they saw our honesty and our sense of integrity. And that was it. And we were trying our best, to find out what SNCC did, actually, and I'll end with this, was that we listened to the local people. As they articulated what their needs and interests were, then we formulated it in such a way and gave it back to them, and they could adopt it. And that was the only way it could have worked the way it did. It started with the people, and we also developed organizing strategies around what people said were their interests and needs.
So in watching the interaction between the two of you, both now and a little earlier, there is a sense of movements that build over time that want to take the good but also want to recognize the difficulty, the contextual realities of it. Janai, I am also interested in what it means to lead an organization that had continuity and that has a particular sort of capacity. You just say LDF into the world, you say NAACP LDF, and people, Thurgood Marshall shows up and just, all the ghosts of a particular version of particularly civil rights wins. And so I'm also interested for you as you stand at a fulcrum point, particularly as a woman in this space that has continuity but also needs rupture in order to keep growing and responding to the new movement.
It's true. I mean, I feel so privileged to work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. We were founded by Thurgood Marshall, and we also had at our helm Constance Baker Motley, a woman who's very much my inspiration. We are unique in that space. That we're celebrating our 75th year of existence. We were founded in 1940, and we have never closed our doors. We have always been active in the struggle for racial justice in all sorts of areas. We're best known for Brown versus Board of Education, but there's so much more that we've done to try to transform this democracy. But you're right, you always need to revisit your strategies. You always need to reignite your imagination about what is possible. We primarily use legal advocacy. We've litigated many cases. We've had many wins, but we have had losses. And we are in a moment of real challenge and difficulty given the conservatism of the court, given the congressional dysfunction. It is a real difficult moment. And it's in those crucial moments that I think some of the ingenuity that we are really best known for really rises to the top, right? This is when we have to be at our most creative, best selves in terms of our thinking, in terms of our strategy. And we're trying to do things differently. We've always operated in a fashion of looking at legal issues in a very holistic way. Brown versus Board of Education wasn't just a case. It was an entire campaign. It was a strategy to integrate our public school systems and ultimately to have that ripple out and integrate society. We did that by using social scientists. We did that by using community organizers. I mean, we ran the gamut, and we recognize that sort of holistic approach is what's still needed today. We're actually launching the Thurgood Marshall Institute as part of our 75th year, and that is to really bring that spirit back to our legal work and to incorporate some of these elements that you've heard about today.
So Avis, in part on that, on both the continuity and the ruptures and the building on, when I first got the invitation to do this, I both thought, well, of course, I'll go. It will be wonderful and a fantastic experience. And I also sort of had that feeling that you have when, like, it's Women's Day at the church. And you're like, actually, maybe like every Sunday could be, every once in a while we could talk about the 4 men who are also here, but really it's ours. So the women in the civil rights movement still give me a certain kind of feeling about who we presume the civil rights movement belongs to, and then like, I don't know what the women folks was doing there to support it. Yeah. So I'm wondering how we intervene in meaningful ways, not just to mark the place where women were, whether they were standing along the wall and providing a kind of guidance to the young people who moved it, whether they were the actual people in the community who were the very people. But how do we not just place them in the movement, but make them the movement?
Well, you know, that's a very keen observation, because to be honest, when most of us think about the civil rights movement, the images that come in our minds are very male images. And oftentimes it's very difficult for us to sort of even contextualize the woman's role in the civil rights movement, when in reality, we were the workers. We were the revolutionaries. We were the inspiration for a lot of the men to be able to come and become involved in that movement. And so, you know, I would say that particularly during my time in NCNW, that was something that, you know, we often wrestle with, given Dr. Haight's legacy of being such a stalwart, not just in the civil rights movement, but also in the women's rights movement. Right. And how do you sort of balance the two? Because, you know, what I find very interesting, sort of living in this space today, is that even though oftentimes we have very similar goals and very similar ambitions and very similar needs, even to this day, I don't really believe that the civil rights movement and the women's rights movements work together well, you know, in very consistent ways in terms of our organizations. We really don't lift each other up in the way that we should. We really don't act in coordination in the way that we should. And so really making sure that we're at the center of those discussions and in the forefront of people's minds means that we need to tell our stories, not only by having instances like what we're experiencing right now, but also by really being in the forefront, you know, by really being in the forefront and not stepping back. You know, just today, for example, we published the State of Black Women in America 2015 with the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. And that way we can really say, this is the Black woman's experience today, and center us in that narrative. And by doing things like that, we can ensure that we won't get left behind and we won't be forgotten.
Okay, but Charlene, so let me come to you on this, because this is the thing that I both am most excited and most troubled about when I look at the kind of current movements around justice, which in so many ways are associated with the issues of racist policing in the nation. On the one hand, the movement itself, if you know anything about it, if you know the leaders, the organizers, those who are informed of it, many of them are doing what and earlier iterations of the movement often had failed to do, which is bursting through the respectability politics around heteronormativity. They are queering the movement. It is often women of color who are, often women of color actually just who are really fabulous and fierce in a whole variety of interesting ways, but often queer African Americans, and also challenging the question of blackness as, you know, simply an embodied reality. Like, y'all just doing all that, just doing all of it. But the story is, black man shot by white police must protect black male bodies against white police. And so I see it as both this extraordinary movement that is intersectional in its realities, but that gets understood and therefore gets passed along in a very heteronormative, masculine way that is still about a kind of Ida B. Wells version of we must protect the black man from the lynching, from the white police officer. So how do we bring the thing that you all actually are into the story?
Yeah, so I thought of two women, actually a couple women, when you began to ask the question. So Rekia Boyd, CeCe McDonald, and Marissa Alexander. And so those are three women who everyone should know about. So Rekia Boyd, April 9th, actually, the cop who killed her is going to trial. She was shot and killed in the alleyway in Chicago. CeCe McDonald was incarcerated in a male prison, and she is a black trans woman. And then Marissa Alexander, I hope you all know her story. She was recently released, but is now on house arrest, right?
I'd add Miriam Carey, who was shot by Capitol Police.
Miriam Carey, right here, right?
Marlene Pinnock.
So
Ayanna Jones.
The list is long, right? The list is very long. And so what that requires is just as in much as we talk about movement building has to have this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece, we have to have multiple people, multiple voices sharing that narrative. You talked about we have to share our story, we have to build this narrative. And even still, I think we're doing that, and it's not enough, right? So we can share our stories, but right up the street at, is it 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
You mean where the Obamas live?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's the address, yes.
Yeah. And so
I love that you're such a local community organizer. You're like, what's the address of the White House again?
I know where his house is in Chicago. I know where that one is. I drive past it all the time.
Right.
So,
over there on the corner in Kenwood next to Farrakhan's house.
Exactly.
No idea where he lives in D.C. though.
Right?
That's so good, yes.
So the problem with that is that what happens at 1600 is a pushing of a program called My Brother's Keeper, which isn't even enough for young black boys, actually. Like, I don't think it's actually what they need. I think it's steeped with respectability and also not getting to the root, like the root of the problems that impact young black and brown boys and men. And so that's happening. We're talking about millions of private dollars and also foundation or public foundation dollars being moved towards this initiative. It is billed as the president's cornerstone policy on race. And then you have folks like Kimberly Crenshaw and Brittany Cooper pushing to say, what about our sisters? Who will, and we put forth, who will keep my sister? If we want to talk about My Brother's Keeper, who will keep my sister? And so I think it's a question largely of, yes, we have to push our narratives. And on the same note, it's deeply a question of power and how power is used, who has organized people and organized money. And all too often, even when that organized money is led by black women, because there are many black women at the helm of My Brother's Keeper, just to be clear, many black women, the conversation often is, we'll get to the girls. We'll get to the women. It's that conversation we have, we'll get to women later. We need to deal with race first. But as a black queer woman, I can't segment those different parts of myself. I'm gonna get this part and then this part of me it's gonna be liberated. And so I just think about folks like Claudia Jones, who is a black feminist communist. Socialist. Sorry. So, yeah, get that right. Because Melissa knows, right? She's like, yeah, I know. Who talked about if we were to free black women, we could, if we were to dismantle all of the oppressive systems that oppress black women, we would free everyone. And I would take it a step further and be more explicit about black trans women. If we were to dismantle those systems that oppress black trans women, we would free everybody. And so we have to actually get at power and not just stick on the narrative. If we're gonna actually get there and talk about who's moving money, who's moving resources, who's moving people, because all too often those folks are much more invested in gaining more privilege and being closer to being equal to cisgender heterosexual white men, or even gay white men for that matter, as opposed to justice. So I'm much more interested in justice.
So then I want to go back to SNCC for a moment, because the horror that happened in the coffee shop last week when Starbucks decided they wanted to host a
That was a trip.
I had in my whole heart, I wanted to call Dunkin' Donuts and I wanted to just say, look, I will be your spokesperson. I had this whole commercial in my head. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and when I want to talk about race, I go to Nerdland. But when I want coffee, I go to Dunkin' Donuts. Where they will not talk to you about race. See? That would have been great, but I did not. But I felt like part of what you were saying there about the dismantling of power. So SNCC is initially this interracial movement, but purposely not to bring white and black students together to have a conversation about race, although undoubtedly there must have been many conversations, but in order to dismantle the work of American racism in the Deep South. And so I was hoping you could give us some insights into thinking about what the difference is between the valuable conversations that can happen between young people about race versus getting together to actually take it apart. Yeah.
Yeah, we worked. We didn't really talk about the implications of what all of this meant. Because if you just, I remember once Lawrence Gilliard, who many of you Washingtonians know, he died a few years ago. we were in a meeting, a SNCC meeting in Jackson, and there was a proposal to do something, and I raised my hand and I said, but if we do this, da-da-da-da-da, because I was going through all the possible permutations of it and what might happen, and Giat turned to me and said, Joyce, if we followed your logic, we wouldn't do a damn thing. I got the message, but he was right, because, and we used to call it paralysis of the analysis. And action was required, and that we were founded to do something, founded based on young people recognizing the, I call ours the Emmett Till generation. And just about everyone I know in SNCC remember and had the picture of Emmett Till on Jet Magazine's cover, unembalmed body and pulled out of Tallahatchie River, seared in their memory and vowed that, like I did when I was 12 years old, one day I'm going to do something about that. And we came along at a time when, number one, children didn't get lynched, men got lynched, black men got lynched. We didn't know about women getting lynched, even though subsequently I learned, the women throughout history had been lynched. And what all of that meant to us was that in deconstructing what actually happened in the movement versus what the common perceptions we have based on images, on television, documentaries, and so on. For example, if we were riding in a car in a dangerous area, women always sat in the back seat. Guys drove the car because they would take the bullet. And then the white women came down and they said that they were being discriminated against because they couldn't go out and organize in the community. And I said, you're damn straight you can't, because you're not going to get me killed. And that was the reality. So if they said they were only allowed to type, they're right. Typing they did. I did a lot of typing because that was what I was rather good at, office work and so on. But it's interesting how we now, or just as Ida B. Wells did, we're gathering ourselves around the men and trying to bring them in closer to us to protect them and to keep them alive. And yet, in the movement, it was the men who stood guard all night with their shotguns except for one community where these sisters' names, what are their names? These two women near Meridian, they stood guard with their shotguns all night. And there was one way into their community and the same road out. And if white people dared come in there, they were going to blow their heads off. And white people understood that, and they didn't go there. Well, what I'm trying to say is, and Charlie Cobb has published a very good book on how not everyone was nonviolent, how local people really were not nonviolent. It was a strategy. Some of us believed in it philosophically and so on. But for the most part, it was the one strategy that kept us alive, for the most part. I am very, very troubled with what's happening today, just as I wouldn't have anticipated that we'd have to fight to keep the Voting Rights Act. Neither did I ever expect that this wholesale brutality and murders of black men, is occurring. And we don't have a strategy on how to take back the power and prevent people from doing it. I mean, every single day just about. I mean, I hear about some case where a man's been killed or there's a video, and a lot of it has to do with social media, and we all have phones and we can now report this. I don't know. and it's tragic. But what I want to know is, how do we, in our local communities, begin to organize against this? We can't keep having marches. And I'm tired of seeing Sharpton out there, I am. I mean, that's just, at my age, I tell the truth now. There's no point in lying. I'm not going to lie about it. Those, what we did, and I'm not saying that we are the gold standard by any means whatsoever, but But what needs to be done is that local communities must organize against the violence. They must develop local strategies that work. And I don't know what they are. They'll vary from one place to the other. But we cannot allow another generation of young men to be subject to the possibility that they'll be murdered when they step outside their house. Now, I think women have to continue to play a strong role in that. And I think that we have to fight for young girls. I mean, I've long been an advocate of all of us have been, of the rights of young girls and of getting them out of poverty as well. But somehow, because I grew up in the Deep South, where the greatest threat was always against men, I always identified with trying to keep men alive.
So Avis, let me come to you on that then, given that you just have the report out.
Yeah.
Because I do think that part of it has to do with what we think the threat is and where it comes from.
Exactly.
And what we begin to identify as it. So there is no question about the horror all of us experience and the anger, I think, and the desire to self-protect communities, particularly when we have the video of the brutalization of young black men, of a 12-year-old shot on a playground within seconds of police arriving, of the sense of that disconnect between the state, whose salaries we pay with our taxes, and then the very clear sense that we cannot call them for help because of this fear. On the other hand, I feel like the violence that is caused against black women's bodies is often not on tape.
Right. You got that right.
And is often perpetrated, not outside of the community, although that happens as well, but often inside of the community.
Yep.
And so part of what happens is we can't talk about that because we're trying to save folks, and so we can't talk about. So from your data, from your work, talk to us a little bit about what the vulnerabilities of women look like, black women look like.
Black women are under attack in America. I'm just going to say it like that. We are. We're the most likely woman in America to be murdered, period. We're 3 times as likely to be murdered than a white woman. And as it relates to the issue of domestic violence, of the most black women who are murdered know their murderer, and of them, over half were murdered by their husband or their boyfriend. So this is a real issue. And one of the reasons why domestic violence takes on a different tone in our community, even though every community is impacted by this, no doubt, is because of this reason that you just bring up. To the very end, we seek to protect our men. Because we know that if we call for help, lethal force may be used against him.
And us.
And us. Because obviously, in the report as well, we lift up the names of black women who've been murdered by police, ranging from 7 to 92. So it's not just our men who are murdered by police, and black women are not navigating our homes safely. But the question is, who are our protectors? Just think about the history of this country and the fact that white womanhood in America has always been protected, even unjustly protected. Oftentimes, the lynchings that you were referred to were connected in some way, shape, or form to protecting a white woman.
Sure.
Who protects black women? Who have ever protected us? And to this day, we still remain vulnerable and without protection. And when we do seek to protect ourselves, look what happened to Marissa. Most of us who are in prison right now for murder are there because we killed someone who was an abuser of us. Right. So we have no protection, and the right to protect ourselves has been taken away, or was never given, quite frankly, to be more accurate. And so we're in a very vulnerable state. And if we truly value the community, we need to not only value our sons, and I am the mother of sons, so I take it very personally when I see a Tamir Rice. I see my son's face. When I see a Trayvon, I see my son's face. I take it very personally. But I do see it as some sort of a formula in terms of how this issue gets played out, not just in the community, but quite frankly, in the media, but quite frankly, by a lot of traditional civil rights organizations. There tends to be a formula to have the weeping black mother of the black son who was killed. Where are the parents of the black daughters who were killed? Where are they? Are they not worthy of that photo op that apparently you're after? And so what I hope that we find one day is the ability to value and love and protect our girls with the same amount of vigor and loyalty that we provide to our boys.
So, Janai, you and I were together in Selma during the 50th anniversary of the march across. I kept not knowing what to call it. They try to brand these things in media, and someone at some point called it the March on Selma. I was like, no, they were totally trying to leave Selma. Like that's the whole story. They were trying to go to Montgomery. Okay, so anyway, marching on Washington, out of Selma. So we were together that time, and part of my joy was having Diane Nash there to talk to, and having Bob Moses there to talk to. And it occurred to me that everybody wanted to ask them about everything that happened 50 years ago, which I get. We were in a commemorative space. But it also makes me wonder if, particularly for, so maybe not particularly, but we're talking about women today, but I think about the 4 little girls in the Birmingham church. And so the work that they do for us is they die. Right? And then we leave them there in that moment, and we don't talk about their families that go on after. Elizabeth Eckford, the work that she does for us is that she takes that abuse as she walks into Little Rock High School, and then we don't know what happens to Elizabeth Eckford's story thereafter. Vivian Malone, the work that she does for us is she provokes the segregation now, segregation forever by standing there in the. But then Vivian Malone goes on to work for the Department of Justice, right? And to have an entire career in a contemporary moment fighting on the questions of civil rights, not only in this one moment when she is sort of martyred as a girl, right? Not literally martyred in the case of Malone, but certainly in the case of the 4 little girls in Birmingham, literally martyred. So I wonder if part of the problem is that we freeze women in these moments. We freeze Coretta Scott King there, right? And we can't kind of keep talking about the civil rights liberation work that's less sexy, that's less camera worthy, but that may in fact be more valuable for doing exactly this work of instantiating the legal framework for equality.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point. We, in some ways, leverage the vulnerability of women at these choice moments. And then, as you said, we don't then talk about how we actually protect them, not just in those moments, but throughout their lifetimes. I have been very delighted to see some new attention being paid to Diane Nash, Amelia Boynton, some of the women of the voting rights movement, and there are many, many more unsung heroes. And I think this is, a time where we're, as you said, we're commemorating, we're looking back at the past, but it's almost as if it happened in this one point in time. We fast forward now, we're paying homage to these elders, but we're not really wondering what were those lives like in the interim. How did these experiences lift up their ability to have more opportunity in life? How did they inspire new generations? We're not really examining the role that these women played in the movement. And I think of just, it's funny you mentioned, I think about even the Brown case. These yes. a little girl a father who went to integrate the school with his little daughter. And she has now gone on to do, Linda Brown, amazing things in the social justice movement. There are women who are still fighting that fight, but when they are in those positions of leadership and transformative change, we're not focusing on them in the same way. And so I think it's important that we think about the opportunism that, and I'm not at all challenging the important roles that they've played, but just that we need that sustained attention. And it's not just for that orchestration of a strategy. We have to have a broader strategy as a community to think about what is the role of these women and these girls, not just in the limelight, but also behind closed doors, in these spaces where the lights and the cameras are gone, and we still recognize that there's, inequality that persists, and that's not being addressed in the same way.
But I think that I want to differ a little here, because I think that let me refer to Charles Payne's book on Greenwood, Mississippi. He made the point that women worked and men led. And I think that's been the case throughout. Women had there not been women who did the day-to-day organizing, we wouldn't have had a movement. We saw the men leading more in some organizations, like, for example, the SCLC, than in others. Those were Miss Baker, the preachers, Miss Baker, Ella Baker couldn't stand. She said, deliver me from Baptist preachers, I can't stand them. And she had reason too, because she was the first executive director of the SCLC, and they wanted to treat her like she was a wife, a maid. No, not a maid, because they didn't have maids, but a wife would have done all the maids' work too. So I think that's always been the case. The other thing is that, except for a few men who were leaders back then and whose lives we have kept up with because they remain fairly public figures, we don't know what most of the people in the movement have been doing.
That's true.
I did a study some years, 30 years ago, I guess, on what the outcomes of people in the movement, mostly in SNCC and CORE, and what they did subsequently. One of the reasons people left the movement, young people left the movement, was number one, battle fatigue. That was the major reason. It'd been there, and it's really hard to go on. We're talking about PTSD now. Back then, we didn't have that term.
Right.
And Dr. Joe, the psychiatrist in New York, would just sort of send you off up to the Poconos for R&R if you, well, that's a secret I shouldn't be telling.
No, it's
Okay, it's out now. Anyway, but the stress was incredible. So battle fatigue set in and people left the movement. And the natural progression of their lives, as they matured, they're moving on to another phase of their life. They either went back to school or they went to work. They got married, they had kids, they went to PTA meetings, they organized in their local communities. They did all of the mundane things that are just the antithesis of the organizer in dangerous spots. So I went back, for example, to the 50th anniversary of CORE, not CORE, of the Freedom Rides in Jackson. And there, the governor, you would not believe, Governor Barber pulled out all the stops, all of the Greyhound buses that took us around, and particularly took us up to Parchment Penitentiary.
Oh, you went to Parchment?
I went because I wanted to see the inside of Parchment.
You went to the Parchment? You went to Parchment?
I went to Parchment. Yeah, I wanted to see Parchment because I always wanted to see how the place where they brutalized Clyde Kennard, who spent 5 years and almost 6 years in Parchment on trumped-up charges for allegedly stealing less than $20 worth of chicken feed because he had tried to enroll at all-white Mississippi Southern College in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, my hometown, now called University of Southern Mississippi. And they arrested him, sent him to prison, and he got colon cancer, was operated on. The doctor told the foreman, not the foreman, the head of Parchment, the warden, that he should be released immediately. They sent him back to Parchment, to the fields, and other prisoners said that he was bleeding as he dragged his cotton sack, trying to pick cotton, feet getting stuck in the mud. And when he got out of prison, I led a campaign, national campaign, to get him out of prison. And Dick Gregory got a plane to come and get him, to take him to Chicago, where he went to Billings Hospital. By then, he was near death. But I went to see him after he got out of prison in Hattiesburg. And he had not a bit of anger or rancor, none. And he only said that he hoped that his experience would shed light on the problems. I was so connected to him because as a little girl, he and Vernon Damer, another martyr, and Damer's sister, Eileen Beard, used to take my sister Dora and me to Jackson to the statewide NAACP meetings. We were 12, 13, 14 years old. And, you know, to have two of your mentors, 3 died. I mean, Medgar, I knew from the time I was a kid, Mr. Damer, and Clyde. And then I was friends with 2 of the 3 civil rights workers who were murdered, James Chaney and Mickey Swerner. And that's a lot for people who are organizing every day to take in. I mean, they went through hell and back. A lot of people who were in the movement won't talk about the movement except with the protected cocoon that we provide each other. We get together, we make jokes about it and have parties and laugh and talk about who dated whom and whatever. Oh yeah, we talked about that a lot. Oh yeah. We had freedom houses that you know, males and females lived in. In each community, we had a freedom house in. And so, anyway. Why are you laughing? No, but we were kids. We had a good time. We were college students, you know. And we only made $9.64 a week after taxes. It was $10 a week, you know, $9.64 after taxes. So if you had a party, you know, somebody bought a bottle of wine and poured it into the punch or whatever. But we had a lot of fun. What I'm trying to say is that we were growing and developing like kids who weren't in the movement, even as we were trying to do that work. Now, what am I trying to say here? Saying that we don't know what most people in the movement have done with their lives.
Right.
Because most of them turned out to be just ordinary folks like the rest of us. We got jobs, we went to school, we got educated, I became a professor. Other people, one thing I'll say is, I can think of only 1, 2, maybe 3 people in SNCC who became, 2 in SNCC and 1 who was a freedom rider, who became business people. 1 became very wealthy, but most of them worked in social service, education, some kind of continuing the same kind of struggle. And what bothers me more, and bothered me a lot about Selma, is that all of those people would go into Selma, a town that hasn't made any economic progress since the 60s. And Oprah had her performance there I said, Oprah's going to lead a march in Selma. And my friends were saying, no, she wouldn't do that. I said, yes, she is going to do it. And she and Common and John Legend got out there. And, I mean, they performed and they marched. I mean, because it was a thing to do. Now, I know a lot of people who would say, I marched with Dr. King. And they probably weren't anywhere within 100 miles of it. And now, the photo op was to be in Selma. It was the happening. And to leave that community, it's in worse shape now than it was back in the 60s. Because those old rundown houses now were newer shacks, newer small frame houses. And to leave that community and leave nothing behind is shameful. That's why I didn't go. And I'm not against people who went. I think it was very important to commemorate. I'd go to all of these meetings to commemorate. I went to the SNCC 50th at Miss Baker's school at Shaw, where SNCC was founded. I went to the Freedom Rides. I went to the Mississippi Freedom Summer last summer at Tougaloo College. And all of that's important. And I'll tell you one other thing I observed about the people who came back from Freedom Summer. That's when a lot of white kids and black students as well came to Mississippi to work for that summer. An incredible number went to law school after they left. A lot of them went to law school. Because we had one day when people got up and talked about what they've done since. And I saw people there that I hadn't known had been in Freedom Summer. The guy who defended George Jackson in the Black Panther Party, I forgot his name. Steve Bingham. Yeah, he was there. I mean, and they have continued to do good, in other words. But most people live ordinary lives.
There are so many things about what you just said that are like almost hard to move on from. And maybe more than anything else, you reminding us that, because we do this kind of courage thing, that there are real human costs to the brutality that people experience. I have a rapid fire round. So this is, any of you jump in on any of these. I just have a bunch of questions I'm just going to ask you. Jump in, give me a little, and then we'll do this rapid fire, and then we're going to go to our audience. Will Loretta Lynch be confirmed?
She better be. She better be. She better be. Yeah. She better be.
What can we do?
And it's, well, we can do something. I mean, it's up to us to make it happen, because clearly Congress is not doing it on its own, and there's no justification for it whatsoever. You cannot have a more qualified, a more dignified, a more deserving Attorney General than Loretta Lynch. And we all need to be calling our Congress people. We need to put the fire, the heat, the brimstone, whatever it takes to get that to happen. It's unacceptable.
Today, or maybe it was yesterday, the young man from Oklahoma, from the SAE video, issued an apology. Should we accept the apology?
No. We discussed this back, and you have a very different view.
I do have a different view, but that's okay. I am the moderator, so that is okay. Will we get a new formula for Section 4 for the Voting Rights Act?
So a lot of these, so I believe in public policy advocacy. I believe in the legislative process, all these things. But just as we didn't imagine being in this moment where we would have to fight for the Voting Rights Act, fighting for Section 4, a new version of Section 4. What is the next thing? So I've been sitting with this question of, like, what does Black imagination look like? What kinds of things can Black people imagine for ourselves? Robin D.G. Kelly talked about Black radical imagination. Black people have always had radical imagination about what kind of world we want to live in. And so how does our imagination go, be inclusive of these questions of Section 4, inclusive of these, I don't know if that's a day-to-day question, but think broader than that. Like, what is our articulation or our desire for democracy in this country, or just how we live, right? Is it democracy? That's the way I think about it. Like, I believe in democracy, but is it that? And how do we even, like, these basic questions? Because even when I think about Loretta Lynch, the reason why I didn't say anything, because the first thing I think of is, like, I do not believe in our criminal justice system in any way, like in its current formation. Like, I don't believe in it, and so I didn't say anything about it, because I hope she's confirmed. But the system that we live in today, prisons, I don't believe in prisons. I actually don't even believe in police. So all these questions, and you were talking earlier about what can local communities do. There are local people who are creating alternatives to calling the police. Like, that is happening in communities across America. So our imagination has to go beyond how do we stop, like, how do we just wrap our arms around our brothers or stop police from shooting them, but how do we even stop the anti-Black police state from existing as it is today? And it may sound radical, and it may sound just controversial, but people are actually working.
So you messed up my next rapid fire question.
Sorry.
Dang it. Which was, we have Susan Rice in the position of NSA, Jay Johnson as the Secretary of Homeland Security, and Eric Holder currently as the Attorney General, and potentially Loretta Lynch, which means if you are being spied on, it's probably by a Black person.
Yeah.
I like to put a little tag at the end of my emails. Hi, y'all.
Yep.
What's up? Susan, Jay, and Eric. Hey. So moving on. So the question is: so is the engagement of Black bodies in this space a moment of progress, where we say, okay, this is the use of these tools of the state that that have been deeply problematic tools of the state, but now they are in the hands not only of Black bodies, but of people who seem to genuinely have the interests of communities at heart? Is that a progress or not? So that went right to that question.
You know, I definitely think it's progress. I mean, I remember when there was somebody different in that White House and what the Justice Department looked like then. And it is a complete 180 from where we were under the previous administration. And so if you don't recognize that that's a market difference, then you're just not paying attention. And I just want to say, I am so thankful that we have Eric Holder and that we have had him. I mean, to me, obviously operating within the limits of the structure that we have, which does not give him the latitude that he needs to be able to really do all the change that we need in this country, obviously. But he has, from the very beginning, to me, personified the namesake of his department. From day one, he has been justice in America, and unapologetically. And I'm so proud of him and thankful for his service.
Yeah, go ahead. I think it's so incredibly important that we don't see this as an either or. I mean, the battle for civil rights and racial justice has never been to replace white supremacy with Black supremacy over Black people, right? That's never been the goal. The goal is to bring a transformative view of justice, of any sort of societal structure to these existing structures. So we can't see it as, well, we're going to invest in the system and only the system, and we're going to leave, radical thought to the side. We've always had, as you said, radical imagination, and that has worked in tandem with, and at times in conjunction with, institutional support. And that's really, I think, where you get the most change, is when you have that radicalism, you also have power within structures that can actually move things forward.
3 more rapid fire questions. Are you ready for Hillary?
No.
Any other perspectives on that?
I'm yawning. Better Hillary than not.
That's a ringing endorsement.
Yeah, no, seriously, I will do whatever a senior citizen does to organize, to help. I mean, I'm tired. I've been around this way before. But the Clintons do bring with them a lot of daily sort of transactional stuff that you have to deal with. It's just stuff. And she has a particular way of operating with her stuff. I mean, the thing about Obama is that he is so focused on problem solving. He loves to solve a problem. And so there's not a lot of drama and extraneous stuff, hanging out there that you got to wade through to get to. But anyway, having said that, I do hope Hillary runs, and I hope she wins. Because God knows if we look at that list of Republicans, that's a doozy. That's a doozy.
I'm just ready to organize against whoever.
Oh, you give them all.
I mean, I'm ready to organize against any, and with or for whatever, any candidate. Because Hillary has got to talk about mass incarceration. She has got to talk about police violence, and she's not going to do it unless we make her.
Absolutely.
And so that's what I'm ready for. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good answer.
You have to push her to make her say anything about anything that she deems controversial. That bothers me.
2 more. Here in Washington, D.C., Jonathan Capehart wrote a piece last week in the Washington Post that said that after a review of the Department of Justice Ferguson report, that hands up, don't shoot was, quote, built on a lie. That Mike Brown did not have his hands up, and that as much as there were key and critical issues associated with the patterns and practices out of Ferguson, that ultimately hands up, don't shoot was built on a lie, and that we must address that. Was hands up, don't shoot built on a lie?
Tori Russell, Ashley Yates, Brittany, Alexis, Tef Poe. I can go down a list of the names of the young black people that I either saw in Ferguson in my short time there, or the young black people who I know who are still there organizing on the ground every single day. And that is not a lie. Like, the work that they do is not a lie. The hands up, the remixes of the chant, it's not a lie. I don't care, actually, what position or what posture Mike Brown was in. I personally do not care. But what I do know what was real is the rage, the outrage, the passion, the desire, and the commitment that resulted after Darren Wilson decided to kill him. Yeah. That is real.
Just one quick thing. You mentioned Ferguson. We have formed a SNCC Legacy Committee and a board, and a lot of SNCC people were contacted by young people who worked in Ferguson and asked us for our advice. And we wrote a really nice statement. I'd like to send it to you. And it's gotten good dissemination. And essentially what we said is that it's your struggle, your fight. You've got to decide what your issues and strategies will be. What we did, this is the way we did it, and so on.
I will, I'm going to ask my very last question. As I do so, I will invite you. There is a mic on this side, and on this side, we'll take some question and answer. And the last question I'll ask in our rapid fire round as we move forward is this. Can we breathe?
Yes.
Breathe. Can we breathe?
We can breathe, but we cannot exhale.
Yeah.
We can breathe.
What she said.
Exhale. We cannot exhale.
Can't let it out.
We obviously need to breathe to get that oxygen, to keep that blood flowing, to keep that fervor and that fever pumping, but we cannot exhale. There's too much work to do, and this is not a state of relaxation.
Begin on this side of the room. And I will ask for everyone, because we do have a large number of people who want to get in, that you keep your questions brief, and I'll do to you what my producers do to me, which is I'll cut you off at a certain point.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Joy Edmondson, and this question is first directed to Dr. Ladner. Some 20 or more years ago now, Dr. Ladner, you were a senior administrator. Before being interim president, you were a senior administrator at Howard University. And you assisted or you supported a group of young women students who were protesting about violence against women on campus. I was one of those students. And
I have a picture.
I have it too. I hope to get it signed, but we'll talk on my time. So my question is, though, I did not find out until within the past 5 years that you were a SNCC veteran. And the question is, how is it? And I'm informed, I'd like to think I am. I've been a lifelong student of the movement. I grew up reading the books of the movement. I took history of civil rights movement there at Howard. Your office was across the yard. And yet I did not know the whole time I was there that you were a SNCC veteran. Now, I can't unpack all of the questions around that here, but the one that I do want to ask is, why do you think that we don't have as much institutional memory around female activists? And as I listened to you recount the stories of Vernon Johns, Medgar Evers, and the other persons, I heard you recounting your memory of men in the movement. The question is,
No, but I talked about Ms. Baker
what do you think can be done to close the gap in institutional memory so that another group of students will know when there's a SNCC veteran woman in their own institution?
Nice.
SNCC prepared me for Howard, to be an administrator at Howard. And for all the work I've done throughout my career, no matter where I was. Learning to organize as a very young person and developing an international perspective on life as we did really made all the difference in the person I became. I don't know why you didn't know that I was a SNCC person. I just don't know. I've never hidden it. It's been, and I hang out with most of the SNCC people, so I don't know.
I'll come to this side of the room.
Okay, my name is Riley Temple, and I am a trustee of the National Archives Foundation. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Dr. Ladner, to some of your friends, following the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner, you wrote that you did not know that your work in civil rights would mean so little. That's the first part of my question. And
This is on Facebook.
Yes.
I
right.
convene on Facebook.
Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha.
And I'm one of your
Sneaking on Facebook.
and I'm one of your friends.
We gotta go.
And so I'd like you to respond to that. Secondly,
Write a paper.
with all of the others, one of the issues in Ferguson and elsewhere was the lack of voter and civic participation. And my question is, what are we doing now to be on the ground to ensure, no matter what the Congress does, this Congress is not dysfunctional with respect to us. And so what do we do on the ground, no matter what the court does, with respect to the Voting Rights Act to ensure greater civic participation among us?
Okay.
So the problem in Ferguson is white supremacy, is decades of divestment from the communities. I used to live in St. Louis. The first time I was stopped, pulled over, harassed by a cop was in North County, right outside of Ferguson, like 6-7 years ago. And so even if we live in a world where the citizens, because that's we can talk about what citizenship means, do not vote, should they not have elected officials, a police department, whoever that is, who are not directly complicit in their oppression every single day? Like, do you have to vote in order to like have some to be able to live with dignity? So if you believe that, and if we're working from that belief that you have to vote in order to live with dignity, then how do we think about the several hundred years in which black people have lived in this country without the access to the franchise, right? And so, my goal isn't to argue with you, sir, but I at least want to demonstrate that, yes, voting is important, it's crucial, but what it doesn't do is dismantle systems, right? Voting is a larger part of civic engagement. It's one part of civic engagement. And after you vote, how are you engaging elected officials, right? What are your demands?
Exactly.